Morning, everybody. It is time to begin. Good to see everybody here. It's good to be together as Christians, as brothers and sisters. Well, I am not Greg. He's not here today. He's fine, but he's not here today. I saw him just last night. I know he's okay. So, we're in the book of Daniel, and thanks everybody for coming this morning. I would prefer to be down there, but I like to use this, and I wouldn't know what to do with this computer thing over here because I had never used it before. So I'm going to be up here. So we just finished chapter 4 in Daniel, and we're going to talk a lot about, I think we need to back into that because to me this is a pivotal point, one of the pivotal points in the book, because we're taking our focus off of what was happening before. And we're going to get into that. We're just going to briefly go through some other things that can come up during the study. I just want to address, especially within the context of atheism and how atheists will try and use the book of Daniel against the Christian. I think we kind of need to understand a few things that they refuse to understand or believe. First of all, they don't want to believe the Bible, so that's kind of, there's no way to argue in that point. So we're going to get just a little bit into that. I don't want to get too far into that. But before we begin, let's all have a word of prayer. Let's pray. Our great Holy Father, we are so thankful, Lord, that you have created this church through your Son. We are so thankful for your word. It is such a great blessing for us, Father, that we can be here together and that we can open the word together and see the power and the might that you have. We hope and pray, Father, that all things we do at this moment would be pleasing to you in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so the first thing I think we want to do is just kind of encapsulate the first 4 chapters. If you were to just title the first 4 chapters, what would that be? It could just be a sentence, anything. Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar. I think that's an excellent point. That's an excellent title. Nebuchadnezzar. Why would we say that? Why would we say the first 4 chapters is about, the book is called Daniel, but why would we say it's about Nebuchadnezzar? Lisa? Captivity. Okay. Captivity. Okay. Because that shines a light on the condition of the protagonist, right? That shines a light on Daniel. Yeah. He's been captured. And I think for me, when I think about being captured, I know what I'm thinking about the leadership and that sort of thing. And I think it's interesting to see how Michi, did you have something?
Like lesser becomes the greater.
Excuse me?
Lesser becomes greater.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
That's right. So you've got the lesser becoming the greater. And that theme as well is really going to play into what we see coming up. And I'm going to try and show us what I found in the secular writings that really reveals what's going on that we don't see necessarily here. Yes. Kate and then Scott. Or Scott and then Kay.
Oh, okay. God showing that he is the Most High
Okay.
God. Or the God.
Okay. So I'm going to put this here because I think this is the right? This is the thought of the day. The king is the Most High, yeah? Or their gods, whatever they choose, is kind of like they work together and they're associated. But this is the revelation we find, isn't it? That God is over, and this is the story of Nebuchadnezzar, and that's his, wow, God is this great God. We see this faith being built into him. Every time something happens, first with, we see Daniel rising above everybody else, but then he interprets the dream, and then he interprets this other vision, and he starts realizing, Nebuchadnezzar realizes that God is God. So my big question was always, not always, but is always when I study this, is Nebuchadnezzar converted like we're converted, who we understand that there's only one God? And I think he's not, but I think he's converted enough for the time, for what happens later on, especially when Jesus comes. Okay.
What's about dreams, idols, and punishment?
Dreams? I'll say visions. We'll see that especially later. And idols? Did you say idols? Okay. So you've got idols and punishment. Again, another big deal for what we're going to talk about in this next story, right? Idols and punishment. Where else do we see that in the Bible? Is that anywhere else? Yes, virtually all the books, right? We just went through Kings, and the kings would either be good or evil. What made them evil? Idolatry. It was this repetitive. This is something we talked about last night with some other Christians from here. There's this repetitive pattern in the Old Testament that God just keeps revealing this over and over again. Don't chase after these things. Don't chase after these things. And, this revelation of who God is. Because people don't understand what's going on. They've made up their own gods. By this time, they're many, hundreds and thousands of years into this making things up, making up their own gods. Anybody else? Gary.
Well, you said it's about faith in God. Faith and obedience is a huge contrast between Nebuchadnezzar and his people and God's captured people, at least some of them.
And it's important that those go together, because too many people try to separate those. But you have that faith and obedience, and we see the faith of Daniel when he tells the king, I can't interpret the dreams, but God can. He didn't know that God was going to do it, but he had faith that he would. And that's that exercising of faith that has the effect on Nebuchadnezzar. Anybody else? Yeah, John.
I'd say that God knew how well Daniel had serviced him, and God uses us in ways that he used Daniel to show the kings and the world of his high power. And that was Daniel's path, was to speak for God and to show his high power as being the king over kings, the gods.
Absolutely, right? Here's a mere man, Daniel, and his purpose is established by God. Is Christianity any different from that? This is something I mentioned last week. This is that foreshadowing of Christianity. Because it's hard for us to understand this, I think, for me anyway, to conceive that mankind doesn't understand who Jehovah God is. If you're raised with it, if you live in a nation of a bunch of people who believe these things, it's difficult to understand that people don't even know who God is. And this is God infiltrating the cultures of the day to reveal who he is through one people. And of course, later it's different. Gary.
I had a note, how to survive in captivity. It's always going to be faith and trust in God.
Okay. So we see this, the idea of survival, and you know, when we get to chapter 6, we're really going to see, again, this providence that God's done. Well, even today, the providence, and I mentioned that a lot with Daniel, because he's very much the same as what happens with Moses, what happens with Joseph, all these guys who end up with kings, and yet it's this, and this is such a great point. It's their faith that helps them survive in these instances. Again, when you get to the next chapter, or chapter 6, what are they going to look for fault? They're looking for fault in Daniel. They don't find any. So what do they have to resort to? Something about his God, because there's no fault in him. And again, Paul brings us out when he talks about us living, you know, through the Spirit. There's no accusation against that can stand, because there's no justification of it. Okay, anything else? Now that covers it really well. It is about Nebuchadnezzar in my mind. This is the story of Daniel. This is his journey after being, exiled, after being captured. And I try to wrap my mind around that action by itself. I'm living, I'm an elite. I live in, my heritage is of elitism. That's Daniel. And these people come, invade my city, tear me away from my family, and move me across the nation to somewhere else. And for me, I look at that and I go, wow, how would I not be bitter and angry every day of my life? But that's not Daniel at all. Okay. All right, anything else? Okay, I just want to spew out, a few facts here that I think we need to look at. And I'm sorry that it's me. This is my ADHD way of looking at things. I find something and I try to piece it all together. So when we look at the written historical text from the Babylonians themselves, and this is, again, this is where the non-believer will come and say, the Bible's not even true. Because historically it's so inaccurate. It's all wrong. How could I even believe a Bible like that? The atheist will confront you with that and tell you you shouldn't believe the Bible because it's not written correctly. Because what they do is first of all, they discount it as a historical document. That's the first thing that happens. And then the second thing is they go, let's compare it to what the Babylonians say. And I just got this online because I want to know what other people think, because I have to make a defense. So according to their own writings, Nabonidus ends up being king. Okay, not Belshazzar. Belshazzar is his son. But let's back up a little bit. You remember Nebuchadnezzar's the king. Nebuchadnezzar, he's the second Nebuchadnezzar. His son Marduk becomes king for a couple of years. Well, this guy Neriglissar is Nebuchadnezzar's general. He comes in and this is just what happens with kings, isn't it? He goes in and murders Amel, and he's king for about 4 years. And his younger son, Labashi, Marduk, is king for about 3 months. Only for about 3 months, because this guy Belshazzar, who we're going to talk about today, Belshazzar murders him. This is their writing. He murders him so he can take his inheritance. And this is important to understand. Belshazzar is driven by greed and ambition. but he can't be king. Why can't he be king? He can't be king because his dad is still alive. His dad should be the king. So what happens? Well, Nabonidus is being advocated to be king by his son. And Nabonidus goes, why would I be king? The writings say that he didn't really want it. He didn't want to be king. He didn't see himself as actually being in line for anything. He wasn't from an elite family or anything like that. However, some of the writings say he was married to Nitocris, which is the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And that is how Belshazzar advocates for his father to be king. When he becomes king, he gets out of Babylon and goes down to Arabia. What's the name of that place? Tema. And he holds a campaign there for 10 years. It says a campaign. Or he took territory and then lived down there. So for all intents and purposes, who's in charge? Belshazzar is in charge. And this is where people will say, see, the Bible's wrong because he never held the title of official king because blah, blah, blah. And he didn't do this and he didn't do that. And so you look at that and you go, okay, well, okay, so what happens? Well, what happens is, who gets to write the history? Who writes history? The victors. Who said that? That's right. The victors write the history. And this sort of thing reveals to us the bigotry that was happening against the Jews. Even though Daniel was in high authority, why don't we see the name of Daniel come up in their manuscripts? Because they hated the Jews. When we get to the story of Esther, why don't we see the writings about Esther? Because they hated the Jews. Why would they hate the Jews? And that's something that I wrote down here. Nabonidus, who was supposed to be king according to their official writings, he's looking to get rid of that god Marduk as the official god of their land and install his own god called Sin. I don't know if it's pronounced Sin. It's got a weird thing over the I, so maybe it's Sign. I don't know. So all of these things are going on. And again, this idea of the gods is a big deal. And God is dealing with it with who? With the Jews. They're writing their own history. And when the person who's ruling over you is Belshazzar, he's the king. It doesn't matter what, here's the thing. This is just all I'm putting out there. It's a perspective, and it is written to a specific people, by a specific people, for a specific reason. Yes? Ida?
Well, I was going to say, this might be totally obvious, but it's good to remember that a lot of times when kings went on campaigns, they would appoint a regent. And as you said, they would be the king.
Exactly.
But you actually have the two people ruling at the same time.
Right.
And that's also in the kings. There's several criticisms of the Bible because of the reigns of different kings and what history says, and it's the same type of thing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Nabonidus couldn't leave, really, right? He couldn't leave without there somebody being in charge, because Babylon is still the center of everything. So he leaves his son in charge. So, when we get into the reading of this, and I think any future reading, like when we talked, when we studied Esther, you remember that the decree went out, right? Haman, tricks the king into this decree. Nobody had a problem with it, because there were enough people who didn't like Jews. That's just what happened. And so this is why we see the difference in the writings. And, you know, if a person wants to debate you on it or tell you you're wrong for believing this, that's about the best you can tell them. There's nuances in the way that history is written, even in our own history, right? We see that even today. Okay, any questions? Okay, now this is just a bunch of stuff that I found online again, and this is from the Midrash and the Talmud teachings of the Jews, just so we can get an idea of what the Jew is thinking about all these writings. The prophecy against Judah in Amos, if a man did flee from a lion and a bear met him, or went into the house and he leaned his hand on the wall and a serpent bit him. Here's something that goes, you're running away from a lion and you meet a bear, so you run into a house and a snake bites you. Well, this is God telling Judah their final judgment, right? Their final judgment is they're saying, God, we need you. We're seeking you. And God says, oh, you don't want me, because it'll be like you're fleeing from a lion and a bear, and you meet a bear. You know, he's telling them the judgment is final. But in the Jewish teachings, they're thinking that these were representing Babylon, the Babylonian leaders. So again, this is how they end up thinking all of these things. And this is why we read what we're reading. And then, of course, there's this prophecy against Babylon in Isaiah that they call, I will rise up against them, saith the Lord of hosts, and cut them from Babylon, the name, who is Nebuchadnezzar, the remnant, his son Amal, and son Belshazzar, and nephew or offspring, which is Vashti. So we see that their teachings was that God was prophesying even against Vashti, which is what we find not too much later in the story of Esther. And then if you remember going all the way back to Abraham, when God cuts that covenant with him and they divide animals in half, and I still remember, I didn't know this until Eric came up and talked about it, that when you cut those animals open like that and you lay them out like that and you pass through them together, it's a blood covenant basically saying, if I don't keep the covenant, this will happen to me. I think I'm correct on that. The Talmud teaches, or I think it was the Talmud, was basically saying that those animals were Babylon. I'm not saying that because that's a true interpretation, but that was the thought and the perception of the Jewish people when they were teaching these things. So that's what's going on in their minds. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so we're going to read verses 1 through 4 of chapter 5 with all these things floating around in our heads. And it's very interesting to me. I mean, I want to hear what you have to say about what's going on here in light of this chapter 3 decree. We'll get to that part. There's a decree already in the land. I don't know, is it no longer in effect? Nebuchadnezzar says, anybody speaks against this Jehovah God is going to be torn limb from limb. That's what he said. Now, there's other things we need to consider as we go along here. Okay, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, he brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, and stone. Okay, So we're going to do what Greg does. We're just going to take a minute, take a look at the text. If you see any phrases or words that you want to bring out that you think are important, that's fine. Or if you have any thoughts, just bring it up. Okay. Does anything jump out at you? Yeah, John.
Seems Belshazzar took the vessels that were from Jerusalem for praising our God, and used them to praise the gods of his own, of gold and silver, and the things that were made of wood and silver, bronze, and stone and wood.
Okay. So here's the action, yeah? Here's this guy Belshazzar. He takes something of God's that belongs to God, right? And he praises his own idols. Is that a problem? Why is that a problem? What's going on here? Anybody have anything else they want to add to that? We're Christians. This is our God. What are we thinking when we read a story like this, right? What are we thinking? Scott?
Well, yeah, it's such a in the face of God, right? To do something like that, those things were dedicated for a very particular use in the temple, for the praise of God, to keep the glory going to Him and everything. And it's interesting that you mentioned that decree that Nebuchadnezzar. We leave Nebuchadnezzar in a really good place. He's said nothing but good about God. He sees God as the Most High. He gets it now. Seems like it really seems like he's in a really good place, and it just jumps right away to which is interesting about what you said. Now we've got this time that's gone on, other kings and things involved. Doesn't matter. Now we've got Belshazzar. We're going to talk about him because this is the next scene to see that he did not even listen to any of the wisdom of Nebuchadnezzar,
Right.
who has given God his proper place as the Most High, and that decree is you don't do things against this God. And this is flat in the face of that decree, and we know in the face of God. So
Maybe there was a technicality because he didn't say anything. Because that was the decree. Don't speak against that God. Barry, and then Michi.
Well, it's been 43 years since the end of chapter 4.
Okay.
So, I don't know how old Belshazzar was, but 43 years went by, and there's nothing remarkable happening since then that we know of.
Okay.
So,
Years have gone by.
out of sight, out of mind,
Out of my,
kind of a thing.
I mean, we get stories on the news. How long does that last in our psyche? About a day, right? the most watched videos, I think, on YouTube are all the 30-second ones. I don't know. Or maybe there's a thing about humans and attention spans. I don't know. Michi, do you have something?
So in verse 1, it says he held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and was drinking wine in the presence of the thousands. When I think of a visual that pops in my mind, I think of somebody who's trying to be an entertainer to distract everybody and kind of be like a showboat to get them to not see what he's actually doing, which is, to me, is like committing adultery against God. Because we are committed to him. It's our covenant to him. Nebuchadnezzar set that example, but now it's being skewed. And if we're not paying attention at that time, if we were then, we would think, oh, so this is also how we're supposed to do it. And because of this showboating that Belshazzar is doing, it could come off as, well, I guess I can do this too, because look at this show, look at this feast, look how grand it is. And then he goes into the gods and the idols.
Yep. Absolutely. All of those things are in play here. He's got 1,000 people, this great audience of these important elites. And he's basically just saying, he's spitting right on God at this point. You know, when I first read this, the first time I read this, and lots of times afterward, because I don't remember the full stories, I always think, did he know what he's doing? And we're going to find out he does know. He does know. Diane.
In verse 3, where it says that they have brought out the gold and silver vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, that was in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Like, did he know that was the God of the Israelites?
Yeah, we're going to see he does.
You know, I mean, then you would think he would know, you shall worship no other gods. That commandment that was in Exodus that was given to the Israelites, the 10 Commandments, you shall worship no other gods, you shall have no other gods before me. And so this is just total in his face, like arrogance or mockery of God.
I kind of look at it like this. He thinks he can assault God. He can assault God and nothing will happen. Because, I mean, it's not like, even though God has done some things over the time that Daniel's been there, all these years go by, where's God? The thing that kind of interested me, kind of reminded me of, was we just went through the kings. Hezekiah was one of the best kings Judah ever saw. Hezekiah got rid of all these idols and did all these great things. And then his son was Manasseh, Judah's worst king. And because of what he did, they got judged and could not escape the judgment. Because when God talks about the judgment coming, he refers to Manasseh. So that for me just reveals how quickly mankind can forget and fall. Lisa.
Well, in the ESV it says he tasted the wine.
Yeah.
But in
Why does
my
he say
version it
that?
says he was under the influence of the wine.
Oh.
So
Oh, I see.
I'm wondering if, much like Artaxerxes in the case of Vashti,
Yeah.
where he later regretted his decision with her, that whether Belshazzar likes it or not, he's going to regret this decision. But he, you know, he's anything that sometimes your sense goes away, right? Just aren't thinking on all cylinders at that point in time.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because when I read this, it made me think of Esther, the whole thing about this drinking party thing going on, and in this case, of course, we see the assault against the Jewish God, and of course, whenever I'm reading these things, like when the king is making a decree, or he has all of his people come together, like, where's Daniel? Where is Daniel? Why isn't Daniel there? No, go ahead.
Well, somebody's going to have to remind him that Daniel is there.
Okay, right. We're going to see that. He doesn't know Daniel. But Daniel, is he not an official anymore? But what about before, when they did things and Daniel wasn't there? Why wasn't Daniel there? I don't know. But I do know from just the study of their own history that they didn't like the Jews. I don't think he was invited. I don't think he was. And he probably didn't want to go anyway because it was going to be a big drinking party.
I was going to say he never wanted their food or wine anyhow.
Yeah, exactly.
And much like Michi said, you know, this is kind of a display of power for his nobles, and look at me and look at everything I have, and then totally disregarding anything that had to do with God, holding God in contempt.
So much of this is such a projection of Christianity, isn't it? You know, about not wanting to look like the rest of the world and understanding there are times when you just don't. And you need to be by yourself or whatever it is, with your family, whatever. Anyway, okay, anything else in here? Yes, that's interesting about the tasting of the wine, because I read that when it says he tasted the wine, then he makes this decision. That really does reveal a lot to me. Aaron?
Yeah, just a few thoughts. Like, why do people celebrate? Why do they throw big parties and feast? I think we need to remind ourselves of the proper way to celebrate, and what is worth celebrating and feasting over. And it's a common theme that when you get things out of order, there is an order to things. God has set things up in an ordered fashion, and anytime we get the order wrong, disaster is on its way in our lives and in a nation's existence. The order is important, and here it's clear that, like Michi said, it's all about him, and that's another theme. And so when we get into we fall prey to celebrating us or our achievements or what we've done. It's the same thing that happened to Nebuchadnezzar on the rooftop, looking at his great nation that he built, that it's time for God to step in and to humble his people, or the opposition in this case. So that's one thought. And there are things worth celebrating, but those things are not us. They are what God has done, and his blessing and his glory, and those are the things we should be celebrating. And then it's just kind of comical to me that they praise the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood, and that's what they're putting in that highest place where God belongs. And they're doing that, and it's just it's a very weird thing to think about. Go get these vessels from the archives, that came out of the temple, and we're going to drink from those that are vessels of gold, and we're going to praise the gods of these cups.
Would you say this was basically a mocking of God? That's how I'm seeing it. As you guys talk about it, they're mocking God, yeah?
Well, it just seems very ignorant and brash. I think it's ignorance more than anything.
Well, they might feel justified. Oh yeah, there's Daniel over there, but he was captured. His God was defeated by our God. Yeah, is that what you're going to say, Scott?
Along that line, I was thinking about those cups and things. We've got all you've got pretty cups, basically. Beautiful, beautiful cups. They're gold and silver. And so the funny thing is that they lift up the thing that was so easily conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, you know, that other guy. It was taken in battle, and they've been keeping it in storage and all that. Now they're praising the gods of those things. It's just so silly to even think that way. And of course, their mindset is we conquered that god in their mind too, not knowing that he actually set that whole thing up to, he put Nebuchadnezzar in power to be able to have that opportunity to carry out his judgment on his own people, not knowing he's doing it for the Most High in the first place. And he taught him that. And now we are, we're right back to praising a piece of metal that was formed by human hands. That you just think of how weak and empty that is.
It is weak. Because they couldn't even decide which one to do, Marduk or sin or whatever god we can think of next. Anything else? Lito.
It's amazing how the wine can corrupt minds most of the time, even nowadays, that he was able to come to the point that he ordered the vessels of gold, which was taken into the temple which was, I believe it's sacred. The Holy of the Holies, taking out all those things that were, Nebuchadnezzar kind of probably did a good thing in there because he put all the vessels into the temple. Unfortunately, Belshazzar at this time took them out of the temple, which is, as you mentioned a while ago, I don't know, maybe he was mocking God. But I think this was a result of the wine which he tasted. And it's kind of challenging to me that you take out which was preserved in the temple of God, taking them out from all the vessels which were gold and everything. I know that golden cup are probably kind of looks lustrous and everything, but my thought was you take out something from the temple of God, and that was kind of a little bit of mocking to me.
Yeah. One of the things that is also in here along those lines, these are dedicated, sanctified emblems that God said make these for this purpose, and now they're basically mocking it. When we see that name Jerusalem, I just kind of read over it, but there is a lot attached to that name for this period. Jesus reveals later that is no longer the case. But God made it clear that is where he will be. He put his name in Jerusalem. And so the more we see this, if you were the Jew reading about it, you understand this absolutely as an assault and a mocking against their Jehovah God. Okay, we just have enough time to I want to read this part really quick. There's only a few verses. And look at what happens to the king. He's really, really happy for a minute. Here's what happens. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand in the light. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his countenance fell, is another way of putting it. And his thoughts alarmed him, and his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. the king was greatly alarmed, and his color changed. So it's only getting worse. And his lords were perplexed. So we're going to, well, let Greg start there next week. But whatever happened, it had an effect on this guy. His knees are knocking together. I had to read that because I'm sorry, it's not funny, but I thought it was funny. The guy's knees are knocking together. That's how scary it really was. Okay, thank you.